Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. I know a lot of comic fans are anticipating the release of Marvel Studios' Avengers Infinity War, and a lot of people are anticipating this adaptation of Marvel's 1990 limited series, The Infinity Gauntlet. However, I'm treating with caution because when I look at this Avengers Infinity War, which is supposed to be an adaptation of that 1990 story, I see a lot of parallels between Avengers Infinity War and 1986's Transformers the movie. Now, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been building up towards the Avengers Infinity War since the beginning of it in 2008 or so. And this is supposed to be the big climax, the Infinity War. However, when I really look at the big picture of this, I see something that could be either incredibly successful or a complete disaster like 1986's Transformers the movie. Now, 1986's Transformers the movie was supposed to be a big climax for the Transformers brand. Now, the Transformers brand had been growing in popularity from 1984 from its initial launch all the way up to 1986. And people were buying Transformers on the regular, they were watching the cartoons, and many kids had formed relationships with characters like Optimus Prime, Bumblebee, Starscream, Megatron, and many others. And when they came to see the Transformers the movie, many kids were anticipating an action-packed, resolution between the war of the Autobots and the Decepticons. Unfortunately, the producers decided to go in a completely different direction. And they decided, because they didn't want to keep using the Diaclone molds to continue making Transformers anymore, they were going to create their own new molds for Transformers. And to get kids interested in buying those new Transformers, such as Cup and Hot Rod and Rodimus Prime, they were going to kill off all the old Transformer characters kids had grown an emotional attachment to. And when they did this, they said they were doing it to show kids the horrors of war. Now, in old Transformers episodes, many Transformers who were damaged were either sent for repairs or they had to go on the space bridge. Like one episode where Optimus Prime was severely damaged, they had to go back to Cybertron to go get a part. But in this movie, these Transformers were going to be killed. And in the first 5 minutes, children were pretty much horrified when they watched many of the characters they grew up watching, such as Prowl and Ratchet and Ironhide, were murdered by Decepticons. And then that initial inciting incident built to a climax where Optimus Prime damaged several Decepticons and then himself wound up dying in a final battle with Megatron. And what many of these executives in Hollywood and Hasbro thought was that kids would just go and move on, but to their horror, they found out that many kids who were watching Transformers this movie were crying in the theater, many were upset, and many parents were so turned off by the carnage they saw on screen that they didn't want to buy a Transformers product related to those new characters. In fact, this movie pretty much damaged the Transformers brand so badly that it didn't recover for 9 years. And when I look at Avengers Infinity War, I see the same pattern setting up. Because in the Infinity Gauntlet, Thanos, who has all power with this Infinity Gauntlet, is looking to worship and get the attention of Lady Death. And a lot of people who have read the story are anticipating a whole bunch of deaths and a whole lot of violence. Unfortunately, what many comic fans will see as just traditional deaths in comics, many kids who grew up today watching the Marvel Cinematic Universe will wind up and possibly being disturbed by seeing these acts of violence presented to them and seeing many characters they grew up forming a connection with die in this Infinity War. And many of these Hollywood executives are probably thinking, oh, these deaths won't merely mean anything because that's just part of being in film, because they've seen things like Star Wars. But we're dealing with small children here. And again, there's a possibility that these kids who have grown an emotional attachment to many of these characters Many of these kids emulate these characters. Many of these kids identify with these characters. Many of these kids relate to these characters. They could feel like this is something horrible happening to them. Because back in 1986, a lot of these kids were latchkey kids, and this was their friend. And to a lot of kids today, characters like Captain America, Iron Man, Black Panther, Spider-Man, many others are their friends because a lot of these kids are growing up in places and they're home and there's no parents there to sit down and talk to them. So this is their friend. And when you kill our friends, it really hurts them because it's like losing a real friend. And this is something that I would think Hollywood executives in Marvel Studios and Hasbro and many others and Marvel Comics would have thought about before they announced this adaptation, because this Infinity Gauntlet story, it could have long-lasting damage to the Marvel Studios brand, because we know that two of the characters, Vision and Doctor Strange, have Infinity Gems. So they're pretty much being marked for death, as I see it, if this movie, proceeds to story and Thanos gets the Infinity Gauntlet. And many other characters are marked for death. And again, this could go really bad if the story, follows the comic. I'm hoping that they do some things to modify things like they did with Captain America Civil War, because Civil War also was another story that pretty much could have done lasting damage to the brand if they followed it to the letter. Now, the other big issue with this Avengers Infinity War that has serious parallels to Transformers the movie is the Thanos character. Now, the Thanos character, he's a super bad in Marvel Comics. And the big problem with Thanos being a super bad in Marvel Comics is that he pretty much worships death, and he pretty much, wants to get death's attention. And yes, that was a great story in 1990. Now, in 1990, Thanos was coming back from the dead from his the last story where he was turned to stone by Adam Warlock when he first tried to get the Infinity Gems back in the 70s. And in this story, he comes back and it's 1990. However, in 2017, the world is completely different. And what made Thanos a super bad in 1990 makes Thanos pretty much a lame in 2017. In 2017 and 2018, when this movie launches, many boys and girls and many men and women do not see Thanos as a super bad. In fact, they see Thanos and the type of man that he is as a lame. Many would call him a simp, a man who submits to women in an effort to get their attention. And because they see Thanos as a simp, they're not going to see him as some sort of super bad with incredible power. No, they're not going to see him like that, because when it comes down to Thanos, we've had a lot of things happen in the media and in the news over the last 25 years. And the first thing that happened was an incident here in New York called the Happy Land murder. Now, in this Happy Land murder, Julio Gonzalez, a man who was having an argument with his girlfriend, got kicked out of this illegal social club called the Happy Land Social Club. And because he was having an argument with his girlfriend, he got kicked out of the club. He got angry and decided, because he could not win the approval of this woman, he was going to go to this gas station, get $1 worth of gas, and then set this social club fire. And when he did this, 87 people wound up dead. And in the aftermath, this man pretty much, he murdered 87 people because he had a fight with a woman. And that was just the first of many incidents. In recent years, we've had incidents by mass murderers such as Dylan Roof, who went into a church and murdered 9 people because the woman he wanted to get the attention of wound up with a black man. And then we had Elliot Rodger, the California mass murderer who went on a killing spree because he couldn't get the attention of this woman who he fantasized about. And when we look at those 3 cases, we see a lot of parallels to Thanos. Thanos is a guy who wants to get the attention of Lady Death. He wants to get her approval, and he's willing to kill to get her approval. That's not really something you want to put on a screen for a movie that's supposed to appeal to families and children. When you think about this Thanos character, he's really going to have to be heavily modified to adapt to the screen, because we've had all these mass murders transpire over the last 20 some odd years, and people's perceptions of this Thanos, again, is not a super bad. They see him as a psycho-simp, an individual who goes out and participates in mass murders all because he can't get the attention of a female or the approval of a female. And that behavior is sociopathic when you think about it. This isn't like your traditional comic book bad guy, like your Obadiah Stane, who's just obsessed with taking control over Stark Enterprises, or your Red Skull, who wants power so he can conquer the world. This is a guy who a lot of people have seen, participate in these acts of violence in real life, and they're seeing this in a fantasy type story. And this is the kind of guy that really creeps people out. He's not a super bad, he's super sick. And that's a fine line that, Marvel Studios has to really think about, because just like the Joker in The Dark Knight, he was an anarchist, but this guy, we've got real life events that pretty much mirror this guy, and I don't know if this is going to go over well with a movie that's supposed to appeal to families and children. I may be wrong, and people may be just excited to see a whole bunch of superheroes beat up on this guy, but when I think about this character, yeah, a lot of people, he was a big popular threat in 1990, but when I look at current events and how they relate to today, it's not, I don't think it's a good character to, put in a movie in 2017, because people's perceptions of that character have changed, and people's perceptions, of this type of person in real life has changed. Just like the Mandarin, back in Marvel Comics. Yes, we had the Mandarin in the 1960s. He was this big red communist Chinese villain, but as time progressed, the Mandarin character pretty much became outdated and outmoded. And I see that with the Thanos character. And what's worse, I see with this movie, is that if we start to see a whole bunch of superheroes winding up dying as a result of this character, it could be a serious backlash at the box office, because one, many of these families and children who aren't comic fans are going to look at and see their favorite characters winding up dying, and then two, a lot of these people are going to be reminded of Elliot Rodger and Dylan Roof and many other of these mass shooters, and they're going to look at this movie and say to themselves, this story is really creepy, this story is really weird, and that's going to really damage the Marvel Comics brand long term, just like Hasbro's Transformers brand was severely damaged after Transformers the movie, because Hasbro thought, oh, we'll make this movie and people will walk into it thinking about these new Transformers, they'll be eager to go out to the store to buy them. What they didn't understand is that people formed emotional attachments to these characters. They formed personal connections with these characters, because many kids who were growing up in the 1980s were latchkey kids. They grew up, the television was the only thing that was in the house that broadcast something to them, and these were their friends. They grew up forming relationships with these characters. They grew up identifying with these characters. And then when they saw their friends dying on screen, it pretty much freaked them out. I mean, I remember being 13 years old and watching that movie for the first time, and it pretty much disturbed me, because, again, I grew up with those characters, and that was one of the incentives that gave me, to move on past Transformers. Now, I was only 13, but I can only imagine what a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old was thinking at that time. And when I think about Infinity War, I think about those 7, 8, and 9-year-olds and how they're growing up with these characters, and how when you're 7, 8, and 9, your favorite character, that's very important to you, and you really don't want to see your favorite character, suffer a horrible death. Even if it can be reversed, it's still a traumatizing image in your mind. Now, I know some people are going to argue that, oh, they do this in Dragon Ball Z and they do this in these video games. But again, some kids don't see things that way, and they form emotional attachments to characters. And that's something that any business has to think about in the fantasy business, because I've also seen this kind of damage done to Warner Brothers DC Comics brand with the New 52. Now, back in 2011, the New DC Comics thought, oh, we can just get rid of all these characters and then go into a new universe with this Flashpoint event. But when they launched the New 52, they wound up with a serious backlash, And many comic fans wanted nothing to do with the New 52 or any sort of DC products. And companies like Mattel pretty much wound up losing a lot of their business because of this New 52. And even DC's own DC Direct or DC Collectibles brand wound up losing business because no one wanted to buy those products. Because, again, people formed attachments to those characters. They identified with those characters. They formed connections with them. And when they saw the company looking to dispose of those characters, they decided to stop buying the products. And this is what I see long term if this movie goes south, that it could severely damage not only the Marvel Studios brand, but the Marvel brand for Disney overall. And it could also do serious damage to the comic book industry. And the way it could do damage to the comic book industry is that the comic book industry has been suffering from a 25-year sales slump. Comics have not gone back to its levels that it was in the late 1980s or the 1990s, when comics were selling 200,000 units of a single B-list title. These days, most comics struggle to sell 50 or 60,000 copies, and even a 50 or 60,000 copies is considered, a big hit these days. And this could really damage the industry long term, because if those kids feel alienated, they're pretty much not going to ever think about buying a comic again or a comic character again. And that's really dangerous because we have a median age of 40 as it relates to comic characters. And the only way the industry was making money these days was with the licensing. And when I look at this movie, I see what could possibly be a disaster on the level of Transformers the movie, because that type of damage would be so extensive that I don't think the overall industry would be able to recover from it, because it took 9 years for the comic book industry to recover from Transformers. It took 9 years for the Transformers brand to recover, but I don't think the comic book industry has that kind of time, because I look at events like DC Rebirth and all these other events like the all new, all different Marvel and all these other things, and it looks like the industry is in its death throes, and this could be the nail in the coffin. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.